What is up, guys? I'm back here with another college football power rankings video. This time I'm going to be talking about the Big Ten. And one quick update for you guys, I just wanted to let you guys know that I saw the feedback on the last video, and I will be changing the format of my rankings. I'm going to be doing them from worst to best instead of best to worst like I did last time. So, that's one difference that I'm doing this time. But also, I just wanted to say thank you guys for watching the last video. We got almost 600 likes or 600 views on it, and that's way more than I thought I would get. So I appreciate everyone for watching. I hope you guys like this video just as much. And then one last thing, I want to clarify that these rankings do not include schedules. So if one team might have a worse record because of how hard their schedule is, that's not going to be really taken into account into my rankings. And neither is injury. However, depth is going to be included. So starting at number 18 at the bottom of the Big Ten, I have Illinois. And things do not look good for the Fighting Illini this year. There's just a lot of talent leaving, and the replacements they have look to be a bit questionable, and there are just holes all over the team. At quarterback, they have Luke Altmaier, who was pretty inconsistent for Illinois last year, and I expect him to be pretty much the same this year. And with them losing players across that offense, I really don't expect this team to excel. They also lost their top talent at pretty much every skill position on offense besides the quarterback. And the pieces they have to fill those holes, they could be solid or they could be a bust. We don't really know, so my expectations are pretty low. And as far as the offensive line goes, they did take some hits. I think the left side is going to be especially weak. But the rest of that offensive line should be okay. And on defense, there's even more question marks. I expect it to be one of the weakest defensive lines in the Big Ten, and the rest of the defense also doesn't really overly impress me. So overall, I think Illinois is going to have a pretty rough year. Too much talent to replace and too much inexperience filling those roles. At number 17, I have Purdue. So I'm going to start with the good, and that's the offensive line. Just like last season, they should be really solid at that position. At quarterback, they have Hudson Card, and while I do think he has a bit of an issue with ball security, he definitely has the potential to play really good ball. And the receiver room is a major concern for me. They did lose 4 of their best pass catchers, including Deion Burks, who's a monster. And in response, they essentially portaled in a whole new wide receiver room, and I don't expect that to be a very successful approach. They do have what looks to be a fantastic running back duo, so that should take some of the pressure off of those receivers. But the real issue with Purdue is the defense. They were the worst in the Big Ten last year against the pass, and I don't think they made the enough adjustments to fix that. And there are pieces that do look nice on the defensive line, but overall I think they're going to be a pretty big weakness for the team. And I think that the ceiling for Purdue is pretty low. At number 16, I have Indiana. And Indiana's a pretty much whole new team this season from a player and staff perspective. They brought in the head coach from James Madison, Curt Cignetti, and with him came almost an entirely new staff and a ton of players from James Madison. This change at staff should be a huge improvement for the Hoosiers and should come with an entirely different look for the team. And there's already early signs that Cignetti is the right guy for the job, as he was already able to convince a few of Indiana's top players to withdraw their names from the portal, and that does not happen if guys do not feel good about their chances of success with a team. Cignetti also brought in a transfer quarterback who was the former offensive player of the year in the MAC, Curtis Rourke, so I expect him to be pretty solid. And the offensive line has been pretty bad lately, but last year they started to take a turn for the better under the offensive coordinator, Bob Bostad, and I expect those improvements to continue. They should pretty much immediately improve on the ground as well, with that running back room pretty much completely reshaped by Cignetti, and their wide receiver room should also be better than what they had in the past. They should basically improve full send on offense. On defense, there's a lot of talent coming in from James Madison, which is a pretty big improvement for the Hoosiers as well. I still do have questions, though, as to how they're going to hold up against other Big Ten teams, especially since a lot of the James Madison transfers occupy the defensive line positions. They were good enough for all Sun Belt honors, but with that, I don't know how they're going to look against the power conference like the Big Ten. Overall, I expect improvements across the board for Indiana, though. It will be pretty hard for a team that's so new with so many transfers and new staff to find immediate success in a conference as good as the Big Ten, but I definitely think they're headed in the right direction. At number 15, I have UCLA, and I expect major regression this year because they lost a lot. For one, they lost their head coach, Chip Kelly, who left to be the offensive coordinator for Ohio State. And his replacement is the former running back coach, Deshaun Foster, and he definitely could be solid, but this is his first head coaching job, so I definitely expect some bumps. But with him being a running back coach, I don't think there's any secret as to what that team's going to focus on this year, running the ball. And luckily for them, they do have a pretty strong and experienced offensive line and two really solid running backs to run the ball. So against most teams, that rushing attack should see success. At least that's what I'm expecting. As for the wide receiver room, they're plenty deep and serviceable for this style of offense. They're reliable when they're needed, but they're definitely not the spotlight. On defense, they did lose an incredible defensive coordinator and a lot of talent along that line, especially in the pass rushing department. Just irreplaceable talent. Elsewhere on the defense, the portal did help fill in some holes, so we don't know how those pieces are going to pan out yet, but they are pretty hopeful. And overall, I definitely think this is a rebuild year for the Bruins. The transfer portal may be able to patch some issues, but they're just relying on too many of them to be successful, in my opinion. At number 14, we have Michigan State, the Spartans, and Jonathan Smith is the new head coach for the Spartans, hailing from Oregon State. RIP the Pac-12. Jonathan Smith was pretty solid at Oregon State, and the Spartans hope he's going to be pretty solid for them as well. Smith wasn't the only staff change, though. The Spartans did also get two new coordinators, and I expect both to be upgrades. At quarterback, Jonathan Smith brought over his quarterback from Oregon State, but not as first string, his second string quarterback, Aiden Childs. And when Childs did play, he played pretty well. And I think his first year starting will be pretty inconsistent with flashes of hope. He does offer a dual threat ability. He can hurt you on the ground and through the air, but I don't have lofty expectations for him due to that lack of experience. And I believe he'll be great eventually, but I think he's going to need some time to settle into that role there. The Spartans did bring in a lot of talent through the portal, a lot of those players from Oregon State, to try and patch up and upgrade that offense. So I do expect some improvements there. One of the biggest weaknesses that the Spartans dealt with last year was a terrible running game. They were the worst in the Big Ten. This year, that should be completely different. They brought in K'Ron Lynch-Adams, and he should be an immediate improvement for the Spartans, especially if that O-line is better, which I do expect it to be. However, the same cannot be said about the defensive line. They lost major pieces late in the portal cycle, and as a result, I think they're pretty thin, despite some of those holes being filled by transfers. They are pretty deep and strong at linebacker, but their secondary is hit or miss. And basically, there's just a lot of new for this team, like I said with some of the other teams. So it's going to be hard to predict whether they're going to be good or not, whether those transfers are going to pan out or not. But I do think they're going to be better than they were last year overall. But I don't really expect that improvement to be drastic enough to catapult them up into the higher levels of the conference. They're still at least a season away from being a more respected Big Ten team again, in my opinion. Number 13, I have the Minnesota Golden Gophers. They have a new quarterback in town, Max Brosmer, from the FCS level, and I'm unsure of what to expect from him because I don't really watch much FCS, but from what I hear, he seems to be impressing a lot of people over there, and he doesn't have that big of shoes to fill anyways, so I expect him to fill in pretty nicely for the Golden Gophers. He does have some solid targets to throw to in the receiver room, but there's more questions than answers there. And I think the Gophers can thank the transfer portal for what they are on the ground this year, as they have a really great running back room and an experienced O-line, mostly thanks to the portal. They should be pretty much better across the entire offense. And defense, however, may not be quite as strong with a new defensive coordinator in town. They also lost several pieces along the line that's going to be hard to replace, and they lost Tyler Newman to the NFL, which is a huge hit to the secondary. I'm not super worried about the secondary, as they do still have some really quality backs back there. And they're always pretty good at developing defensive backs as well. But the line is a pretty big concern for me, which is the main reason I have them this low. At number 12, I have Northwestern. Northwestern had some unexpected success last year, but can they replicate it? Well, starting with the offense, they made a change at the coordinator position, bringing in the offensive coordinator from back-to-back FCS National Championship team South Dakota State, and they also brought in Mississippi State transfer Mike Wright to play at quarterback, who isn't the most proven talent, as he's not been on very many successful teams, but hopefully Northwestern can get high-level play out of him. They're also fine at receiver, fine at running back, but their offensive line is still pretty thin. And as for defense, they were surprisingly good last year, and they returned a lot of the guys that made them so good, including most of the defensive line and the linebackers. But they did lose some guys in the secondary, so there are definitely questions back there, especially at corner. At number 11, I have the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Like Northwestern, Rutgers had some unexpected success last year. They're a pretty sneaky good team. They also still have their star running back, Kyle Monangai. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He will likely be the focal point of that offense again. The Scarlet Knights did make a move at quarterback, bringing in Minnesota transfer quarterback Ethan Kaliak-Manis, who wasn't great last year for the Gophers, so he probably is the biggest question mark on offense. The rest of the offense should be just as good, if not incrementally better than they were last year. And on defense, I'm actually very high on Rutgers as they return a lot of the veterans from a unit that was already great last year. They did lose some guys in the secondary, so that could be a point of concern also, like Northwestern. At number 10, I have Washington, the Huskies. And I know they made it all the way to the national championship last year, but they lost a lot across the board, both staff and players. They lost their head coach to Alabama. Most of the staff either went with him or went to the NFL. They lost their Heisman quarterback finalist to the NFL. They lost their star wide receiver, Roma Dunze, to the NFL. And that's just the short list. Basically, Washington got gutted. They did hire Jedd Fisch, who I think is a massively underrated coach, and I do like that hire. But with the mass exodus of talent, my expectations are not too high for the Huskies this year. I expect a pretty sizable fall off for them, similar to what we saw from TCU last year. So let's break it down, starting with offense. At quarterback, they did pick up Will Rogers from Mississippi State, which pretty much tells me this team is going to be a very pass-heavy team because that's what Will Rogers is. He's an air raid quarterback. He's a veteran player with experience, so I think he's going to serve the Huskies pretty well, especially when they need him to pass. Unfortunately, the offense will consist of almost entirely new starters for the team, so it's more than fair to assume that they'll take multiple steps back at almost every level. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of potential in that offense and even some possible stars, but to match what last year's unit was able to do would be a miracle given the circumstances. However, not being as good as last year definitely does not mean bad. They did pick up several high-level skill position players from the portal, but the biggest question mark for them is the offensive line. It's a unit that was award-winning last year, but most of the players that contributed to that line are gone, so it's going to have to be next man up. They also lost players on defense, retaining only 2 starters. They weren't the greatest defense in the world last year, so that might not be as big of a hit to them. They did add some talent to their secondary via the portal, and they hired a new linebacker coach from the NFL, Steve Belichick. So they should definitely see improvement in the areas that I just mentioned. The defensive line is highly talented, but it's also made up of a lot of lower division players, so time can only tell if those players are good enough to compete with Big Ten offensive lines. Despite all that left the team, Jedd Fisch was able to put together the 11th best transfer portal class to save the Huskies from going into complete freefall. So I think Washington will be able to stay afloat, but also rebuild this year for a brighter future. At number 9, I have the Iowa Hawkeyes. I think everyone pretty much knows what to expect from Iowa. Stellar defense, pitiful offense. They did finally get rid of their offensive coordinator, Brian Ferentz, so brighter days may be ahead for the Hawkeyes. Former head coach Western Michigan is going to take over that role, and to be honest, who's replacing him is less important than the fact that he's actually being replaced, because I don't think I've ever seen a worse offense in the sport than what Iowa has been under Brian Ferentz. Iowa also does return starting quarterback Cade McNamara, who was injured early last season, didn't get to play a lot last season, so the Hawkeyes are hopeful that he can be a key piece in rebuilding the offense, and while I don't think he has the highest ceiling in the world, he should be plenty good enough for Iowa to see improvement. The problem is that Iowa does lack depth at receiver, and while the offensive line is mostly intact and they're pretty experienced, their group has underperformed in the past, so hopefully the new coordinator can get more out of them. The running back room actually does look pretty deep this year with a lot of solid options, but their success depends on if the line can block well enough for them to get through. And once again, Iowa does have a really solid tight end in veteran Luke Lachey, who may be the best and most reliable pass catcher they have. On defense, they basically reloaded at almost every level. They're super deep. Most of the key players on defense are returning this year, including the super dominant defensive line. They did lose Cooper DeJean in the secondary, but I doubt they're going to have much problem reloading at that position because they always know how to put together an incredible defense. In short, great defense, poor offense, as per usual. At number 8, I have the Nebraska Cornhuskers, and the biggest note to make about Nebraska is their pickup of 5-star quarterback Dylan Raiola. And while he's only a freshman, he should be a massive improvement immediately for the Huskers, even if he does see some inconsistency in his first year. The Huskers also picked up some really good passing options via the portal, and I expect that group to be much stronger than they were last year. I do still have concerns about the offensive line and their pass blocking ability, especially since there's a new freshman quarterback in the backfield, and those quarterbacks might have a harder time when the line is not keeping their blocks. Speaking of the backfield, though, they should really be fine at running back, but not spectacular. And on defense, they should look pretty similar to what they were last year, which is dominant. They retain most of their defensive line and the linebacker room as well. They should be great. They are a bit thin in the secondary, but the starters are really solid, so if they can stay healthy, they'll be perfectly fine at that position and across the whole defense. At number 7, I have the Wisconsin Badgers, and Luke Fickell is still in town as the head coach, which is one of the bigger reasons I'm high on them this year. Obviously, last year they weren't incredible, but that was Fickell's first year, and I don't think the team had warmed up to his offensive style in that first year. Hopefully in year 2, the team settles into that system and is able to execute at a higher level. Wisconsin did bring in Tyler Van Dyke from Miami at quarterback, which I'm not super high on Tyler Van Dyke after he underperformed for the Hurricanes. He's a pure passer, which should help them stretch the field, but the real question is whether or not he can make good decisions and protect the ball. He should have some decent throw options, though, in the wide receiver room, although they are a unit that did underperform last year, so we're going to have to wait and see. Fortunately for the Badgers, their offensive line looks to be one of their biggest strengths, which should definitely help Van Dyke at quarterback have more time in the pocket to make good decisions. And it should also help the running back room be more productive despite not having a clear superstar in that room. As for the defense, I do expect improvement. They have big bodies at the line and good depth. They landed a monster pass rusher in John Pius and a really solid group of linebackers. Basically, they should be able to stop the run very effectively, and they're pretty much set at secondary as well. Overall, Wisconsin should be better than they were last year, but I don't expect them to contend for anything major this year. At number 6, I have the USC Trojans, and Lincoln Riley has made the decision to focus more heavily on defense this year, which is definitely necessary for the future of the program. But we still have to wait and see on if they're going to see results in their first season after making this decision. I do think Riley made some incredible hires on the defensive side of the ball as far as staff goes, but I don't think we're going to see massive improvements just yet because while the staff has changed, the player talent level has not. I do trust that the new staff can get as much out of those players as possible, but again, the talent level is not good enough for massive improvements. They did lose some talent at the receiver position. However, they do have some great players that should be able to reload for them, and I trust Riley's ability to develop offensive skill players. As for the running back, USC made moves in the transfer portal, which should provide the Trojans with more versatile talent at that position. But the biggest weakness for the Trojans is still the offensive line. Pretty similar to what they were last year, which wasn't great, and I doubt their ability to hold up against Big Ten defensive lines. Speaking of defensive line, USC is weak here too, outside of Bear Alexander, much like they were last year. They did pick up a difference maker at linebacker in the portal who should immediately make an impact on USC's defense. And in the secondary, USC is basically relying on a myriad of transfers. To keep it simple, I expect a slightly worse offense, but a slightly better defense. At number 5, I have the Maryland Terps. Quarterback Talia Tagovailoa is gone, so who's going to replace him? My guess is Billy Edwards. They have some pretty solid depth behind him for that level of program, so that's exciting, but they don't have anyone like Talia. The Terps also portaled in some key pieces along the line, all capable additions which will hopefully help Maryland improve on the ground because the backfield is only as good as the guys up front. Speaking of the backfield, the running back room is pretty much the same as last year. Not great, but serviceable enough. But at wide receiver, Maryland is surprisingly deep and full of talent. They pretty much have all you could want out of a wide receiver room. Maryland even has some really quality guys at tight end as well that can definitely do some damage. Even without Tagovailoa, the offense should be sneaky good. On defense, Maryland returns a veteran front seven and really solid linebackers, making it really hard for other teams to run the ball on them. And the secondary should also be solid despite losing a few key starters. Honestly, Maryland is a super well-balanced team, and I think that they're going to shock a lot of people in the fall, especially since there are no divisions in the Big Ten anymore. I haven't really seen anyone else this high on Maryland, for this season at least, so maybe I'm missing something, or maybe I'm completely off, but this is just my opinion. I think I'm making a lot of assumptions. I know that the quarterback room, the DBs, the O-line, all those position groups feature new starters for Maryland that could definitely go south, but I feel like that's going to turn out well for them. I don't think they're going to have an issue. At number 4, I have the Michigan Wolverines, the defending national champions, and they might look pretty low on this list to some people, but they did lose the head coach and most of the players that made the team so good last year. Starting quarterback, running back, wide receiver, all 5 starting linemen, all no longer on the team. So I definitely expect Michigan to be less good, at least on the offensive side of the ball. The staff is pretty much entirely new. Sharon Moore, who was the offensive coordinator, is now the head coach, and both coordinators are different as well. Donovan Edwards does return this year at the running back position, and he's already shown some real shine in the past for the Wolverines. Heck, he's even on the cover of EA College Football 25, and he may very well be the best player they have on offense. Basically, they're really solid at both running back and tight end. And at quarterback, it looks like Alex Orji is going to be the starter. He's a great athlete, but there are concerns about his passing ability. If he can get that figured out, though, I think he could be a real difference maker for the Wolverines. The offensive line is littered with questions due to inexperience and transfer additions, but I think they're going to be mostly fine. And I'm not super sold on their wide receiver room. It's a position that does not have a ton of depth, and I don't think there's a lot of talent in that room either. But like I said, they have their great pass-catching tight end, Colston Loveland, who will be a key player for that offense. And basically, I feel like we're going to see a pretty similar style of offense from Michigan, ground and pound with a few short passes thrown in, utilizing that monster tight end. But I do think there's going to be a drop-off in efficiency from that offense. On defense, they should be incredible again. They should have a really, really solid defensive line. They do lack depth at the edge position, but the first-string guys should not see much of a drop-off, and their linebacker room has expanded thanks to the portal. On the back end, there's some lack of experience, but they have Will Johnson back there who could pretty much shut down any receiver that's put up against him. Overall on defense, expect Michigan to remain elite. I think that they won't have many issues on that side of the ball. They did lose some guys, but they have an experienced and deep group back there. It should be their biggest strength by far. At number 3, I have Penn State, the Nittany Lions, who have been very consistent under Franklin, but they have not been able to get over the big game hump. They did have some staff churn this year, most notably losing Manny Diaz, that defensive coordinator who turned that defense into a super solid unit. Even without Diaz, I expect greatness on that side of the ball. A little concerned about the edge rushers as they lost their 2 best ones, but the interior of that defensive line should be mostly intact and should have similar results. Linebacker is an area of concern for the Nittany Lions, as they did lose some really good quality guys at that position. And as for secondary, I'm not entirely sure what to expect, but they did get some pieces from the portal that I think look to be really good if they can pan out. And I think it's safe to say that the Nittany Lions will be a bit weaker on defense overall after losing all the players that they did and losing such a great defensive coordinator. On offense, however, they do bring back Drew Aller at quarterback, who didn't exactly perform how most fans had expected him to in his debut season last year, but he should be improved this year after getting some experience under his belt and having the offseason to continue developing. And the Nittany Lions really need him to be more explosive this year if they want to succeed. And that explosiveness may be pretty hard to come by since the wide receiver room is honestly pretty thin. They did pick up some players in the portal that should help, but we are not sure how they will pan out. They do retain Tyler Warren at tight end, who was one of Aller's go-to guys last year, and they have an incredible 1-2 punch at running back in Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. They should be an incredible running back duo. The offensive line is a question mark for the team, though, so we'll see how productive those backs are going to be able to be with that offensive line. And overall, I think Penn State will have a pretty elite defense again. Maybe not the same scale that they had last year, but still really good. And I expect some offensive improvement. I think they're going to be better overall, but I think they're going to struggle in bigger games as usual. At number 2, I have new addition to the Big Ten, Oregon, the Ducks. And first off, I'm a huge Dan Lanning fan. He really turned Oregon around fast, so I have a lot of respect for him. They did lose Bo Nix to the NFL at quarterback, but they have a Heisman contender in Dylan Gabriel to fill in that spot, so not a huge drop-off. They should be really solid at quarterback this year. They did lose their best receiver and center to the NFL, which is a pretty big hit, but I think offensively, Oregon will be just fine, if not even better than they were last year. The offensive line does look to be incredible this year with plenty of future NFL talent. At running back, they did lose Bucky Irving, but they should still have a really solid rushing attack, so I'm not too worried about that. At wide receiver, they have several high-quality guys, so keep an eye out for that. Basically, Oregon's going to be able to beat you in any way they want to offensively. On the defensive side of the ball, they did have a lot of player turnover, so it's a group that's going to rely pretty heavily on transfers. Luckily for them, though, those transfers look to be really solid pieces, and they look to be really well equipped to stop the run due to the quality of that defensive line. But there are questions about the secondary, although there is still a lot of talent back there. Oregon is probably the only team that came from the Pac-12 that feels like they are physical enough to truly compete along the line of scrimmage with the rest of the Big Ten. And at number 1, the best team in the Big Ten, possibly the best team in the country this year, I have Ohio State, the Buckeyes. And almost every single position seems to be elite for the Buckeyes. They obtained Will Howard at quarterback, and while I do think he's better than Kyle McCord, he's going to serve a similar purpose for Ohio State. He's not the kind of quarterback that's going to put the team on his back or anything, but if he can get the ball where it needs to be and make good decisions, he's going to be everything that team needs him to be. And if he isn't, there are plenty of quality guys behind him that can do the job just fine. I also have to point out that they have a two-headed monster in the running back room with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, possibly the best running back room in the entire country. It's just absolutely disgusting. And while they did lose Marvin Harrison Jr. at receiver, they do still have a lot of quality guys there, including Emeka Egbuka. And yeah, the rest of that room should be really, really solid as well. And I'm unsure of who's going to start at tight end, so that could be a weakness for the team, although it's not a huge deal. And I think the offensive line should be better. They definitely have questions at center, though, after seeing Seth McLaughlin, their transfer from Alabama, play there and have snapping trouble. So we'll see if he continues to have snapping trouble at Ohio State. But on defense, Ohio State is elite. That line looks to be incredible, just as it was last year, and the secondary is so good, and it only upgraded due to the portal. Caleb Downs is possibly the best player on the entire team, and they have incredible depth as well. Should be a really hard team to pass the ball on, and a really hard team to run the ball on. Just an incredible defense. Overall, I think that Ohio State looks to be very scary across the board. I think that this year they should really shine. And what better year to do that than when your rival is expected to have a down year? So, yeah, this is probably the scariest team. Probably the number 1 team in the country for my money. If maybe Georgia does their back and forth, but man, Ohio State's going to be disgusting this year. So that's my list from worst to best, the Big Ten. Let me know what you guys think. Please like and subscribe, and I appreciate you guys for watching so much. Next video, I'm going to be covering the ACC from worst to best, so stay tuned for that one. I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to put that one out, but again, I appreciate you guys for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Peace.